as I previously mentioned. And so this is the general framework that we use to understand the concept of a price control. Price controls are, just a form of government policy. So it's one of these situations where if the government decides they want to price control something, either maybe through a democratic process where voters actually vote for price control power, or rather if the government sort of imposes a particular price control. These come in the form of two essential forms: a legal maximum, which we refer to as a ceiling, meaning that you can't charge above a particular price, and a legal minimum, or what we refer to as a floor, meaning you can't charge below it. Price controls actually show up quite a bit, mostly in an unfortunate way. You see price controls show up in terms of oftentimes in big cities where rent prices can be relatively exorbitant. You'll see policymakers sometimes decide they actually want to control the price of rent, at least for some small proportion of total rental units, the purpose of which is to maintain rental unit prices at a affordable price, especially for low-income individuals. But we also see price controls in a lot of other markets. In a lot of agricultural markets, you in fact have price controls. For example, in the corn market, we in fact have a price floor, which actually elevates the price of corn within the U.S. far above what it actually would be if we allowed the corn market to equilibrate. And the reason why we have these controls is so corn farmers still have an incentive to produce corn. Corn is a very cheap product, and it's made in a lot of parts of the world. And so U.S. corn farmers oftentimes lack an incentive to produce corn because there just aren't many profits to be made. But what the government does is they subsidize corn and then also price control corn to make sure that corn farmers are getting a high price for their corn. And as a result, what this creates is a situation where a lot more corn is produced in the corn market than otherwise would have been produced if we instead just allowed the market to equilibrate. And we'll talk about sort of what the economic consequences of this are. Then you also have price controls in agricultural markets that are similar to rent control, or at least the purpose of them are, where the government decides that, for example, a product like milk, which is often seen as a required good and a necessary good, especially for young mothers with children, that we want to control the price of milk such that it remains affordable. And so actually there'll be a price ceiling applied to milk, which disallows markets or farmers to sell milk above a particular price. And again, the idea here is that we were trying to keep the price of milk low to make sure that people can afford milk. Of course, issue here is that both of these policies, price floors and price ceilings, create what we call distortions. They take the market away from what the equilibrium would have been, and they push it to some other disequilibrium position. Now, the first fundamental welfare theorem tells us that competitive markets maximize economic efficiency. So under the first fundamental welfare theorem, a price control would cause inefficiency because we're moving off of that competitive equilibrium. So if we just look at this in a more specific way, a binding price ceiling, for example, this is a price control which is set below equilibrium, which means that firms cannot sell above this particular price. And so as we can see here, this creates deadweight loss, as we previously predicted, because again, this is off equilibrium. And so despite the fact that the government may be imposing this particular price control because they want to make, say, for example, milk more affordable, the fact is that as a result, a lot fewer units of milk, or whatever the price controlled product is, are theoretically going to be consumed. Because at this lower price, suppliers don't have the same incentive they did to supply the good at equilibrium. And so instead of supplying 500 units, the supply of the good is only 300 units. And so despite the fact that at a price of $3, quantity demand is 700 units, suppliers are only willing to bring 300 units to market. And so we have a 400 unit shortage in this particular market. We have a $400 deadweight loss, and as a result, we also see that producers are much worse off than they would have been under equilibrium. And if we just did a little bit of math, we would also find out that consumers are in fact better off. And so the price control on whatever product this is, we previously had mentioned milk, helps consumers because they now get to pay a price below what they would previously. However, we should also point out that fewer consumers actually consume the product now. Previously, 500 units were consumed, but now only 300 units. So consumers are better off. But only those who previously would be willing to pay $7 for milk are actually better off. And so now instead of paying $7 for milk, they pay only $3 for milk. And so they're much better off. Producers are certainly worse off. But more importantly than all this, the market as a whole is worse off. If we were to add up consumer and producer surplus and compute total economic surplus, we would see that it is absolutely less than what total economic surplus would have been under equilibrium. Of course, we know this because there's deadweight loss. And anytime there's deadweight loss, this is a reduction in total economic surplus. So with a binding price ceiling, we set a price below equilibrium. This creates a shortage where quantity demand is greater than quantity supplied. This also creates deadweight loss, and overall this leads to a less economic outcome than we would have had if the market had been left to equilibrate at its own equilibrium. Now, on the other end of the spectrum, we have a binding price floor, which is set above equilibrium. In this scenario, this creates a surplus because quantity supplied is now greater than quantity demand. We also, of course, have deadweight loss. And we can see that in this scenario, producers are now better off while consumers are worse off. Of course, this makes sense because the floor is pushing the price that's being charged in the market above equilibrium. And so this benefits those producers who are able to still sell their goods, and certainly hurts the consumers who still purchase the good. And again, the idea here is that the market wants to equilibrate at a particular point, but you're distorting it away from that equilibrium. You're getting in the way of the natural market forces, which we've already discussed, we believe push the market towards equilibrium. So in a sense, you're keeping the market away from equilibrium. And this violates first fundamental welfare theorem. So if we again believe that the first fundamental welfare theorem is correct about the efficiency of markets, then intervening in those markets with price controls should lead to reduced economic outcomes. And so the resulting outcome of the market should actually be worse than it would have been prior to the policy change. And so in a sense, this is getting at a relatively classic unintended consequence. Regardless of whether we're talking about a price ceiling, which seeks to keep prices low, or a price floor, which seeks to keep prices high, the resulting outcomes can in fact be adverse to the very people you're trying to help. For example, in a price ceiling, you're trying to help consumers by lowering the price that they have to pay for a particular product. However, you also greatly reduce the actual amount of the product that is consumed. And what is likely the case is that you're cutting a lot of the very people you're trying to help out with the particular price control from the market. Here, this was the original distance of the demand curve to equilibrium, and we saw that it was 500 units. At this new price, the distance is much further, all the way down here to 700. However, we know that 700 units will not be supplied. Only 300 units will be. So all of these individuals in this part of the demand curve who would be willing to buy the product at this low price of 3 may not in fact get access to the product. Because in fact, it could be the case that because only 300 units are consumed, the product is much more scarce. And as a result, they actually don't even get to take advantage of the product. This actually happens in the context of rent control. And we'll talk a little bit more about that here in just a few moments. On the other end of the spectrum, as I was just mentioning with corn, because we price control corn upwards, what we do is we actually create a situation where the quantity demand for corn is below that of supply. And so as a result, this creates that deadweight loss. Now, of course, what our government does as a result is they in fact pay corn producers enough money that they actually will still produce 700 units. Because at this particular price, farmers know that they're only going to get 300 units demanded. And so there's, in fact, this sort of situation in which farmers, in a sense, would prefer then to maybe produce another product where the demand is actually high enough that they can earn a profit. But instead what the government does is it, in fact, pays corn farmers to produce 700 units, produce 700 units and it actually creates the surplus. So in the United States, we actually have these massive surpluses of corn, which again, according to economic theory, is very inefficient. By having these massive stores of corn, as a result, what we now do is we use corn for a lot of things that we previously had not used it for. One of the things that we actually use corn for now is we feed agricultural animals, predominantly beef and pigs, corn a lot more than we used to, for two reasons. One, because corn is so friggin' cheap, because we've price controlled it and we're actually paying corn farmers to produce a lot of corn. But what we're also doing is we're finding out that if you feed these animals corn, it beefs them up, no pun intended, and the farmers now can make more money on them. So not only it helps with their cost because now they're feeding their animals corn, but it also helps because the actual output of the animals, whether it beef or whether it be pork, is actually much higher. So there's all these weird sort of interesting unintended consequences that can arise from these relatively sort of singular markets. It's one of the reasons why I refer to this chapter in my lecture notes as markets all the way down. Because when you start thinking about markets, and we'll talk about this a little bit more in the next set of videos when we talk about capital and labor markets, is that really, our economic system is so vast and full of so many different markets, but they're very interconnected oftentimes. And so you can change one thing, price control corn, for example, and it can have these impacts on the dairy market and the pork market, which I think is just sort of super interesting. So let's talk about our experience with two particular price controls and just talk a little bit about sort of theory versus reality. It gives us sort of an opportunity to talk about that. So first we're going to talk about the minimum wage. The minimum wage is a binding price floor. If we go back to this particular graph, we can see that this is exactly what a minimum wage would do. The idea is that the current market prevailing wage is an equilibrium wage. And instead of that prevailing wage being sufficient, the government believes that, in fact, that wage is not sufficient. Sometimes you hear minimum wages referred to as living wages. In a sense, this is the amount of money that we believe you need just to, say, pay the bills. And so the minimum wage is therefore a binding price floor where now you're telling employers you cannot offer wages which are below this particular floor. Now, again, according to economic theory, what this would cause is if we realize that supply of labor is you and me, and demand for labor are employers, and we would see that there would be this large surplus of labor. In other words, there would be more people willing to work for this particular wage than you would actually see employers demanding labor at that particular wage, which, in a sense, makes intuitive sense. Telling employers they have to pay a higher wage than they would want to pay may in fact cause employers to reduce the total number of employees that they have. At least that's sort of the concern. The other concern that we often have with things like the minimum wage, again going back to that idea that markets are interconnected, is that if we raise the minimum wage, then this could then cause the overall prices of goods to rise, because if employers now have to pay their employees more, they may then turn around and raise the prices of their products, which would, generally speaking, be the common sense sort of profit maximizing decision. If I increase the cost of your production by forcing you to pay your employees more, then you may instead increase your price to offset that particular increase in cost. So the question is, what have we seen? What is the actual sort of outcomes of the minimum wage? Well, we have, we have a long history with the minimum wage. Here's a graph which shows the increases in the minimum wage over time. This is the nominal. This is the nominal increase. This is the real increase. In other words, this is sort of accounting for inflation, and then these are the actual numbers, or what we call the statutory rates. What you're told you're paid, and then sort of what you're paid relative to the cost of living. So we can see that the current minimum wage, which is higher than this, current minimum wage is a little bit over $10 now. This graph's a little bit out of date, but we can see that a wage of around $7.50 to $8 to $10 is around sort of historically where the minimum wage has been. But the point of this is just to point out that the minimum wage has increased, considerably. We have chosen to increase it considerably and chosen to increase it numerous times over the last 60 years. And so if there were these adverse effects from minimum wage, then the fact that we've raised the minimum wage so many times, we would sort of expect to see them. So in this graph, what we have is the blue line is consumer price index, which is how we compute inflation, and the red line is the unemployment rate. And as you can see, despite the fact that over this time period, as you saw in this graph, the minimum wage was consistently increased, what we see in this particular graph is that in fact there has been virtually no long-term increase in inflation. In fact, inflation has historically been very low over the last 30 years. And we also can see that there's been virtually no adverse impact on the employment level, or in this case, the opposite of this, the unemployment rate. We see there's sort of virtually no change in the unemployment rate stemming from any of these particular changes. In fact, the unemployment rate really only seems to be affected by the economy itself. These gray bars here are referred to recessionary periods. And so we can see during recessions, unemployment rate were to rise, and then after recessions, unemployment rate falls, as we would expect. And so here we can see that the minimum wage had not, at least from these particular numbers, had the adverse effect that we would say expect to see according to economic theory. Now, it has to be said that if the government were to raise minimum wage to a very high amount, then this almost assuredly would cause large distortions. I think the story here is not that minimum wage inherently doesn't create distortions. I think what this story tells us is that small incremental changes in the minimum wage do not seem to have the adverse effects that we would typically see. We'll talk a little bit more about why the minimum wage has not created the economic distortions that economic theory would tell us it would create in the next lecture video. But to wrap up this lecture video, I want to briefly talk about the experience of rent control. Rent control, if we go back here, would be a binding price ceiling, the goal of which would be to keep the cost of renting an apartment low. Large cities tried rent control, New York, San Francisco, Chicago, for example, in the 1960s, as these cities found that it was their rental prices were very high and very difficult for people to afford. Not much has changed, as you can see. What would a binding price ceiling into rental markets do to the actual cost of renting markets? Would it create more affordable apartments? Would it say have any appreciable impact on the actual number of units offered to low-income individuals? And the fact is, no, it didn't. It had the opposite effect. In fact, what we saw was that the number of affordable rental units actually fell in the city, and the actual average rental price rose. And so the effect of rent control was precisely the exact opposite of its intended purpose. And so we can just look at a series of figures to sort of drive this point home. So in this particular figure, what the blue bars represent is the actual sort of advertised rental prices for apartments in Philadelphia. And the red line is the median advertised rent and for Philadelphia as well. As you can see, the distribution of rental prices in Philadelphia sort of is normally distributed about this particular median. So the rental prices in Philadelphia are about what we would expect them to be, right? So you have some which are, exorbitant, very expensive, but for the most part, most of the rental prices are about at that particular median. It's important to point out Philadelphia did not try rent control, and so their rental prices are really about where you would expect them to be. The same is true with Phoenix, Arizona. Again, generally speaking, you have the distribution of rental prices right where you would expect them to be. Now, San Francisco. Of course, we see with San Francisco, where rent control was used, we have a much different situation. So we have the median advertised rent is much greater than where you would expect the median rent to be. That's the solid red line. Notice in both Arizona and as well as Philadelphia that the red and solid lines are equivalent, essentially. What this means is that this is where we expect rental prices to be, but this is where we actually see rental prices in terms of advertisement. And then if we look at the distribution of rental prices, we can see that we have a lot more skewed to the left. And so the idea is that rental controls, rental price controls, likely reduced the availability of more affordable rental units. And as a result, this skewed the rental price distribution way high. And so in San Francisco, for example, as a result, there just weren't that many affordable rental units left after price controls were installed. So again, this is exactly what theory would tell us would occur. If we go back to here, the price control, we expect to reduce the supply of the units, which is exactly what happened in the places where rent control was tried. If we look in New York, we can see the same story. This is where we would expect the average, or excuse me, median rental price to be. This is where we actually see the median rental price again. We see a lack of affordable rental units below the actual rental line, and again, a skewed distribution upwards. And so again, New York City tried rent control, and it actually seemed to reduce the affordable number of affordable units, in the rental price market. So in conclusion, price controls distort markets away from equilibrium, creating surpluses or shortages and deadweight loss. Floors create surpluses, while ceilings create shortages. Deadweight loss represents the loss in economic efficiency when markets aren't in equilibrium. But if we look at the actual markets, whether they adhere to these particular outcomes depends upon the markets themselves. We'll talk a little bit more again why the labor market maybe doesn't behave according to theory with respect to the minimum wage. But as we saw with the rental control into the rental market, the price controls in the rental market, in fact, there was behavior very much according to theory. So, on one hand, theory does really well. On the other hand, maybe theory doesn't do so well. What we'll learn in the next video, in fact, is that there's something going on in labor markets that perhaps caused them to behave that particular way. And so that's really sort of the root cause. So until next time.